ของรอบบ้านเลยมันคือเราในแบงค์แล้ววันลูกได้แบบว่าชื่อที่เรียกว่า I remember a while. Yeah, so
All right, so today we're going to move into our next set of time periods. So we're moving from the Cambrian into the Ordovician and the Silurian. Framing where we are. So you may or may not have noticed, because the schedule isn't fully filled out, but basically each of our units is corresponding to one of the eras here of life. So we started in our first unit here with the Precambrian, really the Archean and the Hadean, with that order. Now we're in the Paleozoic, so we've spent a fair amount of time here in the Cambrian, practicing some of our phylogenetic terms, our evolutionary concepts, and focusing them in on the Cambrian explosion and what's going on there. So for the next week or so, we're going to walk through some of the rest of these periods. And then our third unit will be in the Mesozoic. The fourth unit is going to be in the Mesozoic. So we're in the Ordovician, about 490 million years ago. We're going to lump this in with the Silurian as we talk about the ecosystems that were present and the organisms that were present, largely because I find the Ordovician a little bit boring. There is change going on here, but a lot of the change that you see happening is kind of a grade happening from the Cambrian into the Silurian. And there's a lot of stuff going on with our marine invertebrates. So we've talked some about those in the Cambrian, and basically what we're going to see in the Ordovician is kind of extensions of those ideas and those processes going on. But let's frame physically where we are and what the world looks like at this point. So the last time we looked at our continents, we were looking in the Precambrian at the continent, supercontinent Rodinia, that broke up, creating really big changes in our atmosphere and in our climate. So here was the arrangement of the continent at that point, around 1 billion-ish years ago. So you'll notice that some of these terms are familiar. Some of them are kind of like our modern continents, right? We've got East Antarctica, that's familiar. Amazonia, things like the Amazon rainforest. Baltica, things like the Baltic Sea. But we also have some terms that are not super in use in everyday parlance, like Laurentia, kind of mapped out where they are here in that original supercontinent. So some of these terms are their own unique terms because they correspond to a lot of lumped together modern day continents, which is kind of how they get their own name. So where we stand is part of Laurentia. So if we want to kind of focus ourselves in as we're looking at continents over time, it's a good word to know, a good word to look for if you're kind of interested in where you are, right? What we would see here. Okay, so Laurentia was big and kind of central in Rodinia and then in that breakup. And as we're moving into the Ordovician and the Silurian, we're basically going to see a lot of what you can kind of think of as flooding. So we're going to have a huge ocean covering more than 50% of the globe. So this is the Panthalassic Ocean. It's going to cover almost all of the northern hemisphere during these time periods, although we will see that we have slow shifting of continents kind of around, so that's a ballpark, not a strict rule. So we have this big Panthalassic Ocean. During the Ordovician, especially, we have a lot of rising sea levels. The sea levels are at their highest, really, during this time period. So you can see that while these continents earlier on were large, relatively, what you can see now during the Ordovician and the Silurian is that a fair amount of these continents has been submerged. So if we're looking here at this Laurentia cluster, which is eventually going to form North America, you can see that a bunch of it is kind of light blue. That's because what we're seeing is that continental shelf covered by shallow sea, essentially. And you can see even a second sort of ocean here, this Paleotepid ocean. That's not super important at this point, but in some of our future time periods, we're going to talk about the tepid sea. So it's kind of related to that, so that'll kind of come back later. Another term about continents to know or continent name to know is Gondwana. So Gondwana is really big. When people talk about sort of two main continents as we talk about movements of plate tectonics over time and kind of paleohistory, eventually we'll be talking about the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea. Gondwana is essentially going to be the southern landmass. We see it forming during this time, and we're going to see its movement also creating some climatic shifts. So you can see that Gondwana is already present here, and we've taken a snapshot at the middle Silurian, but we can think of this arrangement being similar for the Ordovician as well. You can see that in the late Jurassic, as we approach modern time, Gondwana is kind of forming this whole southern landmass still, and you can see the continents kind of looking a bit more familiar within Gondwana. So you can see South America here and Africa kind of smushed together. And that's a good sort of ballpark also way to think about Gondwana. So on this image, we can see we have Africa here, we have Arabia, we have India. So a lot of our modern day more southern continents are here. Okay. So that's where we are at this point in time. And here's a preview of kind of where we're going. Okay. So it's worth thinking, making sure we're all on the same page a little bit about plate tectonics and that movement. Right. So when we talked about the layers of the Earth, we didn't focus in too deeply, and we're not going to focus in too deeply right now. We just want to make sure that we understand kind of what's happening when we talk about continents breaking up or ridges forming mountain ranges and how that's affecting the environment our organisms are in. So what's going on, right, is that we have a really hot inner core of the Earth, and we have that heat moving out towards the crust, right? Like the heat is dissipating, gotta go somewhere, it goes out. The mantle is rocky, so the mantle is the layer below the crust. We're living on the crust. So it's rocky, but in terms of like long periods of time, it's still plastic enough, deformable enough that it can move just very slowly. And the reason we do see it move is that heat. So that heat coming out creates convection currents. So convection is just this movement, this kind of swirling motion created by those differences in heat. And so if you've ever noticed like that your oven says it's a convection oven, right? You can relate that, right? So this has to do with movement of heat through, I don't want to say an atmosphere, right? Because the mantle is rock, but like through an environment. So you can see that heat coming out, and you can see how it's swirling around. So that's this convection aspect. So as the mantle is moving, we have our crust sitting on top of it. So that's this gray layer here. And so you can see how that movement of the mantle in this image here is dragging pieces of the crust with it. So as we drag these chunks of crust, essentially, that's what a plate is, what a tectonic plate is. So these divisions of the crust that are being moved together as one kind of slab or one piece by this convection and movement in the mantle. So we can see points where we have one of these plates moving under another. And we can see that there's a trench forming right at that division, right? So when you think about like ocean trenches, that's part of what's going on. And you can see that a ridge is forming here in the middle. This is more like an ocean ridge rather than like a mountain ridge. What's happening here is that as our continents, our plates are pulling apart. This exposes essentially new material. So we have new crust kind of forming in this zone. So if we want to look at it slightly more realistic view or slightly more relatable to our modern day view, right? So we still see that convection current here underneath in the mantle. Okay, so we have this motion of the plate outward. And in this case, we're looking at oceanic plates. So that's a lot of where we're still living at this point in time, right? We're still kind of in the ocean. So the oceanic plate's moving outward. And here we can see a continental plate. You can see that point where this oceanic plate is going under the continental plate. So when this happens, there's a specific name for that movement called subduction. So this oceanic plate is being pulled under the continental plate, being subducted. So here we see an ocean ridge forming at that rift, so that split as those plates are pulling apart. So this is how ridges in the ocean form. You can kind of see that movement happening. You can see rising magma kind of coming out in this gap, forming that ridge. And we know other things are going on other places, right? We know we have volcanoes in various zones of the earth. So there are other places where we have rising magma kind of spurring up as well. But this is just basically what we want to know about like why our continents are moving. So we've got this mantle moving, which is why we're going to see our continents pulling apart and smashing back together as we see them pushed and pulled by these motions caused by these convections. So here's just another sort of time scale. I think the movement of these continents is pretty. We've got a time lapse of it. Okay. So we can see that kind of movement. And we're ballpark kind of in here as we're going through the Ordovician and into the solar. So my favorite thing about the Ordovician, it's actually not an organism specifically in the Ordovician, but why it exists in the first place as a system, like as a geologic time period. So back in the day, in the 1800s, there are these two guys, Adam Sedgwick and Roderick Murchison, and essentially the Ordovician exists because they had an enormous fight. So they identified the Devonian system together, and we'll talk about that later. It's coming down the line, it's a bit more modern. But then they sort of drifted apart and they were identifying their own individual time periods in different parts of Great Britain. Okay. So Adam Sedgwick named the Cambrian system in 1835, and then Roderick Murchison named the Silurian system, which is where we're going, in 1839. Right, so you know here already that we missed the Ordovician. So what was happening was basically after they each named their own time periods, they started, say they were getting greedy, right? So they started expanding their own time periods and including more and more of the geologic time scale into their own sort of specialty, their own separately named time period, until they got to the point that they were both claiming basically the same rocks for their own system, right? And this basically completely ruins their friendship, right? And it was a pretty vicious fight. Okay. Which is funny because like one of the things that they were fighting about was this trilobite. So this is an example of one of the organisms that was present in this sort of section of overlap that they were fighting over between the Cambrian and the Silurian. So we've looked at trilobites before, so we can see those three lobes, right? We have this axial lobe, the pleural lobes where it has the gills. We can see that cephalon, that head part, and you can see some kind of spines coming down the side. All right, so it looks like a trilobite. Murchison actually named it after Sedgwick while they were friends, which is why it's called Angelina sedgwickii. But they could not agree over which of their time periods it should belong to. And it got to the point that Murchison was president of the Geological Society of London, which was basically where they were talking about all the science in Great Britain in the day. And while he was present, he ended up completely banning Sedgwick from talking publicly about Paleozoic life at all, right? So like basically kicked him out of science or tried to kick him out of science. And they actually never resolved this fight. They argued about it and were at this basically vicious scientific war for 20 years, which only ended at the point that Murchison died. So if you want to say that they quote unquote made up, Sedgwick did tell Murchison's wife that he was sorry that he died, but I'm not sure that really counts if you only have any regret after someone else dies. Okay, so that's kind of my favorite fact about the Ordovician, because the reason it exists is to describe that sort of time period that they were fighting over. So Charles Lapworth decided that we should just separate it out, that the really old stuff, the clearly old stuff, would be the Cambrian, the newer stuff would be the Silurian, and the segment in the middle that had been alternately assigned to either one, depending on whose side you were taking, was going to be its own period, the Ordovician. So here we see some of the forms of life that was present in the Ordovician. And this is kind of why I say that there's kind of a grade happening from the Cambrian to the Silurian. Right, so the Ordovician was being assigned to one or the other, partially because you can see some similar processes happening with each of those periods. And we really have an overlap in the fauna and the ecosystems that are typical of the Cambrian and typical of the Silurian, all kind of existing at once in this little central period. So what is going on in the Ordovician? So things to know about the climate. It was very hot. We have these high sea levels, and these are forming seas at the edge of continents, which are going to be shallow, which means we're going to have good light penetration down to that sediment layer at the bottom. So we're going to have benthic organisms there. We're going to have organisms swimming around in that sort of warm, sunnier water in this shallow part of the sea. As you get deeper, you get colder. So that shallowness really helps maintain that warmth as well. One of the named events that's happening in the Ordovician is something called the Ordovician biodiversification event, or also the Ordovician radiation. So what's happening here is basically that we continue to see really rapid diversification, really a big spread of new organisms, just like we did when we were looking at the Cambrian explosion. So we were looking at that origin of all the different marine animal phyla. Now we have tons of new genera, so at a lower level appearing, and we have sort of finer details being added on to those general body plans during this period. And a lot of it is happening at once. One of the dominant life forms, or really a dominant lifestyle during this period, is suspension feeding. And so we've read in some of our papers different types of feeding. So I like this little simple diagram of two of the types of feeding you can see in these marine environments. So the suspension feeding is with these suspended particles, right? So here we see some sort of bivalve, something like a clam or something, sucking that suspension feeding down. So you can think of filter feeders filtering water as being kind of a modification of the suspension feeding. Versus deposit feeding, you can see like a bivalve with kind of like a tongue sort of process, kind of scooping up things that have fallen onto the sediment. So lots of suspension feeding going on in warm, shallow sea. They're going to start to see like early kind of forms of reefs forming. So that's the kind of environment we're in when we're looking at a lot of these organisms. Okay. So some of the fossils we might see if we were looking at Ordovician deposits would be bryozoans. So bryozoans our group that still exists today. They're sometimes described as moth animals. Basically, they form these little colonies with these kind of tubes coming out. So here we can see those tubes kind of fossilizing from this Ordovician deposit, this Ordovician rock. We also have crinoids, lots and lots of them. These are really prevalent in the Ordovician. So they're echinoderms, so kind of related to sea stars, although actually they're more closely related to brittle stars. But if you look up a picture of a brittle star, unless you're super into ocean life, it's probably going to look kind of like a starfish to you because that body plan is kind of similar. So you can see that we have almost a kind of flowery kind of structure here, even though we're looking at an animal. So we have an attachment here down to our substrate, so to the bottom. And then we have that more star-shaped structure up here at the top, kind of flowing out. So here we see some images of that. And here we see some fossils of what those crinoids look like in the Ordovician. Okay. We do have a lot of brachiopod diversification in the Ordovician. Look at the Ordovician, a lot about marine invertebrates. And poking around. There we've got here the two trays of some fossil brachiopods. So we kind of waved our hands when they came up on the list for our different animal phyla, but they are that group that kind of looks like a clam, kind of looks like a bivalve, but they are actually relatively distant from our bivalves on our phylogeny. So they're not terribly closely related to them. So in terms of similarities and differences, if we're looking at their shapes, bivalves for clams, mussels, things like that, those are in our mollusk group. So they're more closely related to like our snails and even like octopuses, octopi, okay? But a bivalve has this sort of plane of symmetry splitting apart its two shells. So the mirror is kind of between this right shell and this left shell. In the brachiopods, which you can see, I believe, on at least some of those fossils, the sort of point of reflection is different. So here it's kind of in the middle, cutting through both of these shells. So we can see that reflection kind of right and left here. And we can see that colored in on these diagrams as well. So you can see here this clam that they picked as an example. This top one is our bivalve, so a mollusk. So the yellow split out from its mirror image to green here. So you can see that plane of symmetry between the two shells reflecting. You can see that from different views. Versus in our brachiopod, you can see that that line of symmetry has almost a depression for it. So that kind of groove that you see splitting both the top shell and the bottom shell kind of in half. Right, so you can see how that groove and that line of symmetry is running through both of the shells. So if you're at the beach looking at various shelled life, this is not necessarily a super important difference to you because they do have very similar shapes. They have really similar forms of life often, but from a phylogenetic perspective, so from an evolution, from a diversity of life perspective, they are pretty different, which makes them a great example of this idea of convergent evolution. So we think that they evolved these pretty similar forms separately from each other. So this is an example of one of our phylogenetic terms that we haven't talked about in a little bit. So convergent evolution, basically the same thing, it's the same thing as this word homoplasy. Right, so homoplasy is when we have two separate evolutionary lineages evolving the same trait. Right, so here we have our brachiopods highlighted. Okay, so we can see a split over here with our brachiopods, right? And then we can see in this diagram, which is one of two hypotheses, this is why this is easier. I thought it was the more easily readable phylogeny, which is why I grabbed this one, but this is not set in stone. So here we can see our mollusks breaking off, but they're sharing a common ancestor with some wormy-like creatures rather than with the brachiopods themselves. So these annelids are a worm, these nemertea, like nematodes, are also like kind of worm-like in shape. So we don't think that they inherited this shelled shape from a common ancestor, because that would have required like a lot of reversions, essentially. So if you imagine a common ancestor that had these two shells, right, then what you're implying with that statement would be that there were two shells in this common ancestor, but only the mollusks and the brachiopods inherited them at all. And in fact, only this one group within the mollusks inherited them, while the annelids, the nemertea, the sporonids, the bryozoans all lost them separately. So that's why we think that this trait evolved separately in these lineages, because that's the more parsimonious explanation. Right? So if we use Occam's razor, we want to go with assume that the easiest thing, the simplest explanation is the true one, the thing that happened, because we don't have a time machine and we can't go check, right? We only need sort of two mutation events sort of to separately evolve these two groups. Whereas from this diagram, real diagram is more complicated, right? We'd have to lose that trait 1, 2, 3, 4 times in order to create the same arrangement of organisms. So that's why we think of this as an example of homophagy. So practicing another one of our terms. So we had some terms that we used to describe groups in phylogeny. So say we decided to describe a group, if we're beachcombing or something, we're just going to describe this group as two-shelled organisms. Right? We're going to come up with some word for them, two shelly things. So if we're thinking about that as a single group, which of those three terms, monophyletic, paraphyletic, or polyphyletic, would we use for that? Yeah, and why? Yeah, so when something is polyphyletic, we're saying that we're talking about a group where we have a sort of unnatural grouping, or at least a grouping that doesn't reflect the evolutionary history. Right, so if we describe a group as being just two-shelled organisms, we're kind of picking and choosing from different places on the tree, which might be useful for us if we are asking a question where we care about shells and don't care about evolution, right? If you're thinking about how two-shelled organisms physically function in an ocean, you might decide to talk about a group in that way rather than look at an evolutionary perspective. But for comparing it to phylogeny, we want to know that that group that we're talking about is polyphyletic, so coming from two sort of separate places on our tree of life. Okay, questions about these words or the phylogeny? We do feed in a lot of practice of the vocabulary that we're using in this unit. Okay. So here's some of those brachiopods, which even though they look like clams, are not actually mollusks. They're their own group. So they've been present for a while. We saw them in the Cambrian explosion, but we have this major diversification event where they're taking on lots of new forms. We have lots of different genera and species appearing in those shallow seas that we see during the Ordovician. So they're going out, and just like those trilobites, they're occupying a lot of different niches. We're seeing adaptive radiation now that we have plenty of space in these warm shallow seas that are really present geographically. And we see that they have this sort of convergent evolution with the bivalves in our mollusk phylum. So those are brachiopods. We also have some gastropods present. So gastropods are another group of mollusks. So this is basically like snails. We basically have snails here in the Ordovician. And we've talked a fair bit about our trilobites. We've still got those trilobites throughout our Paleozoic. So here are some of the ones that were present in the Ordovician. Another type of organism that was present at this time were something called graptolites. So graptolites, you can almost, well, they're really common. I guess I'll just say it that way. So a graptolite is another index fossil for identifying strata of this time period. So we said trilobites fossilize easily. There are lots of them, so we can use them to date rocks. Same thing with graptolites because of how common and easily fossilized they are during this period. They're essentially kind of like community organisms as well. So we can see this kind of tube-like structure. That's basically all we have to say here about graptolites, other than that they have a lot of different forms, just like we were kind of examining with those trilobites. So looking at the type of graptolites present can help you figure out where you are in the time scale during these periods. Okay. So one thing that is true about the graptolites during this time period that makes them so prevalent is that early on, they start out as benthic organisms, kind of anchored on boulders and in mud on that sort of sandy, muddy slope at the bottom of the ocean. But during this time period, they adapt to these shallow seas and become free-floating. So we start to see them able to take on a lot of new forms as they're becoming some of the earliest kind of floating organisms in the water. So they're kind of expanding out into that new ecological niche, into that sort of territory. So here we see some of the different forms that you might expect for a graptolite. The more fun organisms around in this time period, I think, are our predators. So they're less common, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? The things that you eat, the things that we eat, like plants and stuff, they tend to be more common than the things that are hunting, fishing, doing the eating. But we do have one massive kind of crazy predator in the Ordovician. So these are nautiloids. So the nautiloids are still present during the modern day, but they're very rare. There are very few of them. So they really have their heyday much earlier on. So their shape is kind of like a squid. So they are a cephalopod. So they're a class of mollusks. So mollusks, we're thinking snails, we're thinking clams, but we're also thinking things like octopi. Right, so you can see this kind of octopus-like, squid-like structure of the fleshy part of the organism up front. It's basically like kind of combing. You can think the sand and the sediment in the ocean, finding other invertebrates to eat and predate upon. You can see its other structure that we see at the back here is this long cone. So they have these straight cone-like shells, which later on start to swirl around. So today's nautiloids have like whorled shells with different chambers. But early on in their evolution, they just got like a big pointy hat, just like I do today. And they are quite large. So they're found cones that are up to about 3 meters in length. So these aren't little tiny things. So this is an example of Orthoceras, which is one of the largest predators during the Ordovician. We're going to take a short movie break and think about these nautiloids. So one of the things that we're thinking about as we're thinking about organisms expanding their range and diversifying and then dying off, we're thinking about like competition between organisms as driving diversity, but also kind of causing extinctions and causing dying off. So we're going to look a little bit at the history of the nautiloids and why we don't see so many of them anymore, because they were around for quite a while.
Here's a lot of really years ago. Diverse animal groups emerged, thrived, and vanished. Entire ecosystems and seascapes have come and gone, and nearly everything was killed off at the time. But through all that change, one thing has remained the same. Almost as long as there has been complex animal life in the ocean, there have been nautiloids. This group of ancient cephalopods, with an octocoprolus, have been a constant presence for around 500 million years. And we even still have species around today in the form of nautilus. But around 30 million years ago, they suffered a mysterious catastrophe. Something gradually began to push them from their former global range into a single remaining refuge, the deep tropical waters of the Indo-West Pacific. But a refuge from what? These hardy survivors have made it through everything the planet has thrown at them across each kind, from a devastating asteroid impact to massive volcanic eruptions. But this was a very different kind of threat. The evolution of a new group of predators that would nearly finish their life. They possibly emerged in the early Cambrian period, but the oldest undisputed fossils only date back around 490. And this was just 30 or 40 million years after the Cambrian explosion, when complex recognizably animal fossils started becoming common in the fossil record. And since then, nautiloids have endured and survived quite a lot, including all 5 mass extinction events in this planet's history. Not to mention the emergence of pretty much every major group of marine predators, from sharks to mosasaurs and ichthyosaurs to whales. So it's fair to say this isn't their first rodeo, and some of their most iconic traits are thought to be ancient adaptations for dealing with these threats, like their famous coil shells, for example. These started out straighter and almost horn-shaped in the late Cambrian. The more predator-resistant coiled forms only evolved later, around the time that early dog fishes and predatory cephalopods arrived. The heyday of nautiloids seems to have been the Ordovician period, from around 485 to 444 years ago, when they were at their most studied work. Though they remained pretty widespread for a long time after that. And while their diversity has slowly declined since then, around 30 million years ago, nautilus fossils began to vanish from the fossil record of marine environments across the world. This contraction of their range eventually left them confined to one small corner of the ocean, the only place that they're found today, the deep waters of the tropical Indo-West Pacific. And the exact reason for this sudden change of fortune has been tricky for scientists to explain. Whatever pushed the nautiluses into their last refuge also still seems to be preventing them from expanding out of it today. But what could be keeping down a group with such a strong record of coping with all kinds of environmental and ecological challenges? Since at least 1979, the leading assumption has been that it was probably some complex interplay of changing ocean circulation and temperature shifts over time. But in 2019, a group of researchers began to wonder if it could be something much simpler, maybe even as simple as a new group of predators that the nautiluses just couldn't deal with. Their approach to investigating this was pretty simple too. Over the next few years, they gathered as much data as they could on the global distribution of nautilus, as well as their possible predators to threats throughout the last 66 million years. And when they published their analysis in 2022, they proposed that they had finally found the culprit. Change due to massive disappearance of Nautilus fossils from any location. And that's the arrival of pinnipeds, which are seals and their relatives. Now, pinnipeds evolved from terrestrial ancestors in the order Carnivora that became what we call secondarily aquatic. And the details of who exactly these ancestors were and how their return to the water happened are kind of murky. There are still some big gaps left to fill in that story. But we do know that by about 28 million years ago, the earliest recognizable pinniped relatives had begun splashing through the water, like an Elaearchus, for example, a genus that contains several extinct species with clear adaptations for swimming, whose fossils have been discovered in coastal Oregon and California. And as the researchers tracked the spread of pinnipeds in the coastal regions around the world, they saw the same pattern again and again. Whenever they arrived, nautiluses vanished, until by the Pliocene epoch, around 5 million years ago, nautilus fossils were gone from everywhere apart from the tropical waters of the Indo-West Pacific, an area notable today for, you guessed it, not having any native pinnipeds. Okay, but it's not like pinnipeds were the first predatory group that nautiluses had, right? They weren't even the first mammalian marine predators. Whales have already returned to the water millions of years earlier. The emergence of a few short-snouted and toothed ancient whale groups did match up with the local disappearance of nautiluses from an area. But that was a blip compared to the global trend that the researchers saw later with the arrival of pinnipeds. So why were whales less of a problem for the nautiluses than seals? Well, the researchers proposed that it came down to their different feeding strategies. Some whales are and were much bigger than them. So nautiluses were either too small to be a worthwhile snack for them, or they were culture feeders. Other groups, like the Bacillosaurus, might have incorporated them into their diet, but still didn't seem to have affected nautiluses much upon the regular. We really don't see modern whales eating nautiluses today either. This is probably because getting them out of their shells takes a different kind of feeding strategy than whales usually use. Pinnipeds, on the other hand, excel at that task. Their so-called pierce feeding technique allows them to catch prey with their sharp teeth and then use suction or vigorous shaking to extract it from its shell. Ancient seal fossils also have features of their skulls and teeth that suggest they could do this too. So it looks like they've appeared with just the right tools to end the reign of the nautilus. The researchers found that only one group seems to have been able to at least temporarily hold out the arrival of pinnipeds in the Oligocene method, a genus called Etruria. They were the athletes of the nautilus, with adaptations for especially fast and agile swimming. Plus, they seem to have had an unusually rapid reproductive. And these traits seem to allow species Etruria to survive, for a while at least, even after the other species of nautilus have been pushed out. Etruria stuck around until the end of the Miocene. But eventually their fossils vanished too, not just from most coastal regions, but globally. So what happened to Etruria? Well, the researchers proposed that they could run, but they couldn't hide. The Etruria was faster and more agile than your average nautilus, sure, which gave them a short-term advantage in coping with the arrival of seals by simply being harder to catch. But that also came with a trade-off. Their thinner, lightweight shell meant that they couldn't swim as deep as the rivers. So while the ancestors of modern nautiluses were able to retreat to greater depths, Etruria just couldn't follow them. And from the extinction of Etruria until now, the oceans have been almost totally nautiloid-free for the first time in around 500 million years. Save for the species that still thrive in the last seal-free paradise. The marine realm is, after all, not so different from the terrestrial realm. And like a flightless bird on an island having to deal with the sudden arrival of a new predator, if pinnipeds were to expand their range, nautiluses might find themselves with nowhere left. This all goes to show that ancient changes of distortion can happen to any group, even one that's been a constant presence in ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. Because nature is at heart pretty chaotic. And from the Nautilus's point of view, that unprecedented chaos might just look a lot like sea.
So those are our nautiloids. I had some decent pictures of the modern day nautiloids in there swimming around. It also makes me wonder, and it's bad if they are really tasty. Interesting that the pinnipeds and the seals really like them so much. Okay, so we do not have any seals way back in the Ordovician, and really we don't have anything to predate upon the nautiloids. So our nautiloids are able to be the top predators during this time period. Okay. I'm the wrong one.
Ocean changed a lot in the last chapter. we had.
Okay. Another cool thing that we have starting to evolve in the oceans during this time period are fish. So they're not going to be super prevalent during the Ordovician, but their origin is dating back pretty far. So this is a great time to start to think about our classifications of fish. So I want you to take a look at this phylogeny and think about those group terms again. So what we want to look at is whether our fish are monophyletic. Are they a monophyletic group? Give me a thumbs up for yes, thumbs down for no. All right, I see mixed here. Okay, so a monophyletic group is one that includes a common ancestor and all of its descendants. So with that definition, looking at these fish, where do we have their common ancestor? Yeah, so like here, right? So at the bottom end here is our common ancestor for all of our fish. Okay. So then we see our branching out of the groups. So we've got some weird stuff. We're going to be in the realm of weird stuff for a while, like hagfish and lamprey. We've got cartilaginous fishes. We've got bony fishes. But then what do we see up here at the top of this phylogeny? Here on this one. Are these things what we think of as fish? Yeah, no, right? So if we were to form a monophyletic group, we would have to include humans and monkeys and cats and all tetrapods, basically. So everything with 4 feet, 4 limbs as fish, right? So to make fish monophyletic, you would have to say that you are a fish. So this is not a monophyletic group in the way that we use the term fish, because we're excluding this branch here. So we can see how the quadrupeds, humans, our ancestor essentially is a sister group over here to our bony fishes. Here, these vertebrates living in the ocean. So not monophyletic. So our fish would be considered a paraphyletic group. So paraphyletic means that we have a common ancestor and we're including most but not all of the descendants. Okay, so we're including this group, but we picked one specific group to leave out. So if we say something's paraphyletic versus polyphyletic, what do you think the difference is there? How would you tell whether you're looking at something paraphyletic or polyphyletic? Or put another way, why am I saying this is paraphyletic instead of polyphyletic?
Because like, early you have that common, that they all. But probably the-
Yeah, so when we're describing something as paraphyletic, right, we are saying that they have this common ancestor, which comes with it the implication that the traits that we're talking about as uniting this group are because they are descended from that common ancestor. So our sort of fish body plan, fish swimming, all that kind of stuff that makes us call something a fish, it is due to the fact that they have this common ancestry. So when we think of something as polyphyletic, we're really tying that to the idea that we've picked some kind of classification that's probably arising due to convergent evolution, so due to homoplasy, so kind of an artificial grouping, whereas paraphyletic, we're talking about something with a common ancestor, but we're leaving out a group or two that doesn't fit. So our humans, our quadrupeds, have evolved their own separate derived characteristics that are different enough that it doesn't make sense to group them in with all these things, even though they have a common ancestor. Although when we looked at those embryology slides, you can see that early on in development, right, embryos kind of do look like this, or early on. Okay. So thinking about these groups of fish, which we're going to start seeing in the Ordovician and the Silurian, we're going to see armored fishes essentially arising. So they're going to look kind of weird. So we're going to have a fish that we call ostracoderms, and then a specialized kind of group in that that's a little more derived called the placoderms. And to understand the ostracoderms and the placoderms, I'm going to point out kind of what's going on here in our general fish phylogeny. Okay. So one of the main divisions we think about when we think about fish, in addition to that cartilaginous versus bony separation, we also think earlier than that about whether they have jaws or not. So Agnatha, this group, are our jawless fishes, and then our jawed fishes are over here. Okay, so Agnatha, I like to think about like if you gnash your teeth, right? And A usually negates things when we're putting it into a word. So can't gnash their teeth because they don't have teeth. So that's Agnatha, right? So our jawless fishes are separating out here in the later part of the Cambrian or the Ordovician or the Silurian. We have this kind of grade happening throughout this group. Okay. And we don't see jawed fishes until kind of over here on the tree. So we're going to have to progress a little bit in time, and we have several things branching off before we get to the evolution of our true jawed fishes. So we will talk more about fish as they start to spread out. So the Devonian is sometimes thought of as our age of fishes, at least according to this diagram. So we can think more about fishes at that point, but we start to see them arising in this earlier time period. So I need to duplicate that, but this is an image of a jawless fish, so Agnatha. So like this would be an example of like a lamprey. So jawless fishes are going to kind of like, instead of having two jaws to bite, they kind of like suction onto things, right? So they can still have teeth and stuff. What they don't have is that movement of the jaws. Okay? So a jawed fish is going to have like a mouth that has these movable parts. Okay, so the armored fish, our ostracoderms and then our placoderms, are cool and can be identified by the fact that they have these like plates on them. So you can see a simple diagram here of an ostracoderm. So we have eyes here in the front. We got some nostrils, so we've got a nose here. So notice that we don't have like jaws listed here, we just have some oral plates. So we do have mouth parts, but not in the way that we think of when we think of a typical fish. What we can see taking up a lot of space here on our head is this dorsal head shield. So this is a hard part of this fish, got this like bony kind of plate on it. You can see that there are some plates elsewhere here on this ostracoderm as well. So we have some here kind of around the gills as well. The ostracoderm, here's a placoderm. So our placoderm, we can see similarly has bony plates, but we got more of them essentially. So we start to see, as fish evolve further, more kind of development of structures. This example actually does have a jaw, kind of showing the modern fish structure. So don't worry about that part, but essentially we're thinking about placoderms as having lots of like plates on their head. So the ostracoderms have some complicated relationships to each other. So this isn't something that you'd necessarily see if you went into the sea during this time period. But we got a couple examples here of our heavily armored ostracoderms, which are jawless at this period in time. So a helpful thing that they have is gills for respiration, as well as these like protective plates forming along their bodies, especially around the head. So, okay, so here we have an example called cephalaspis, or cephalaspis. Okay, so some innovations here in this ostracoderm is that it's developing a paired group of pectoral fins. So we can start to see paired fins kind of happening at the edges, stabilizing its movement. It doesn't have a jaw, so it's got this toothless kind of mouth. It has a well-armored head up here at the front, so you can almost think of this as like a shell in front. But it doesn't actually have a skeleton, so it doesn't have an axial skeleton, it doesn't have vertebrae. So instead, it's got this kind of plate on the outside. Another example of an ostracoderm here is Lysanias. Right, so this one is kind of more streamlined in shape. So this is really kind of an open hole here at the mouth parts. We see a lot of radiation of similar things to these, to this example, to Lysanias, as we move through the Silurian and into the next period, the Devonian. While this is related to the other ostracoderms, some of the other ostracoderms, we don't have that like armored head shield on this one. So it's becoming a little more different as it becomes more streamlined and starts to adapt to different environments. Here are some more ostracoderms. So these were probably filtering particles on the ocean bottom, possibly kind of scooping them up. Okay, so possibly kind of somewhere in between a filter feeder and maybe short-toothed deposit feeder. They may have been able to feed on some soft-bodied organisms. So these ones still jawless. While you do see kind of ridges on this artist rendering, they're not really having paired fins in this specific group. So we have some different kind of radiation going on in the ostracoderms early on in their evolution during this time period. But it's cool that we're starting to have fish, which is going to make our oceans look a little more like our modern day oceans, modern day kind of communities of marine organisms. So that's where we're leaving off today. And next time, I think we're gonna talk a little bit about colonization of land, because it's during this time period that we start to have